Good morning, everyone. Today, this talk is about debugging the debugger, and mainly it's debugging the debugger from the Firefox devtools. Quick question. How many sitting here can relate to this situation of only using console.log to debug JavaScript code, including me? For sure, it's okay to admit, right? Console.log does its job, it's easy and convenient, and most importantly, things work. But what is not good is, it's not good at catching errors as they appear or digging deep into the code to find really where things are broken. And to do this, we need a comprehensive tool like the debugger. Luckily, modern-day browsers have a debugger which has a comprehensive set of tools, and this will help you fix and repair the broken code. Using a debugger is not only fast and easy, but once you learn how to use it, you will definitely realize that it can save you from hours of frustration. So once again, good morning. My name is Princiya, and I am the lead engineer leading the mobile and front-end, the web teams at Kurali Gambia. And this is a digital health company based out of Berlin. As already mentioned by the Master of Ceremony today, I advocate for open source, diversity and inclusion, and privacy and security. I am also part of this Mozilla Tech Speaker program, which is a community-based program where volunteers like me speak to technical audience about Firefox, open web, and all things about community. I have also been an outreachy intern, which is open source program to bring more underrepresented folks into open source. And I have been a prototype fellow for last year, which is a German open source grant from the it's from the German government. Speaking of today's topic, the debugger, I am one of the community maintainer for the Firefox DevTools debugger project. In 2017, I landed my first pull request for this, the debugger, and back then it was my first pull request for open source at all. It was not easy in this overwhelming world, but luckily the debugger's stack, which is built using React and Redux, made me feel comfortable to work on a web application, and I had my first pull request. And back then, the pull request was flexing these, the top line that you see. So I applied CSS Flexbox, and yeah, the things worked. So coming today to be a community maintainer and to have contributed to a lot of other open source projects, it's been a great ride so far. And speaking here about this particular project is quite an honor for me. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. Quick question, who coined the term debugging? Anyone? It goes to Admiral Grace Hopper. So back then, when she was working with computers, which were the size of this big, which occupied half the size of the room, it was quite easy for tiny little bugs to enter the inner workings of the system. And one such day, there was a bug or a moth which was blocking the inner operations of one of these vacuum tubes in these computers. And one of our associates made notes saying, we have one practical case of bug being found in computer systems, and that dates back to the history of saying, we found a bug in computer system, and the debugging term obviously dates back to removing the bug out of the system. Talking about the evolution of the debugger. Mozilla's first debugger was called Venkman. Is anyone here of the Venkman era or the Venkman generation? Or anyone knows of the reference to Venkman, to Mozilla's first debugger? Wankman, the name dates to one of the characters played by Bill Murray in one of his in the movies Ghostbusters. And in the year 2000, this is how the debugger looked like. And around 2006, there was Firebug, and the story of Firebug and Firefox is quite synonymous to the rise of the modern web. In 2016, Firebug was unified with the modern DevTools. What is there, like the inspector tool, console, network, and debugger also was part of that. And in 2017, the world said bye-bye to Firebug, and all of this was unified into the modern set of DevTools, what is there in the current version of Firefox. So starting from 2000 to almost 2016 and to this day, this is how the debugger UI has evolved until date. The debugger anatomy, or what comprises the debugger. This is the list of sources. So as you debug your code, it's quite important to see all the list of files that are there. And the mid panel is the source pane, or which shows the source code itself. And the last tab is a bunch of tools, and the tools include the different tools, like you can pause the program, you can step over, you can step out, you can step in, or you can step out. And there is also the possibility to add certain watch expressions if you want to look for a particular expression and to know its value. Say, for example, title, as you debug some complex code or just a simple code instead of using console.log. And as you see, the logo, the React logo, so the debugger also shows the different, the kind of source that comes from the code that you have written. What is it like? Is it Angular? Is it TypeScript? Or is it Vue? Or is it React? Another quick question, who invented breakpoints? Breakpoints are usually associated to debugger, and there must be some history behind breakpoints. Anyone? It was Elizabeth Holberton, and again, back in the days when she was working on one of Huon's equation, which is a second-order linearly differential equation. There was actually, they had not fed the right data into the system, and to debug, again, back then, the big computers, Elizabeth and her team had to literally pull the wires to stop the working of the computer so that they could debug it, and that's how the term breakpoint was invented. It's like literally pulling down the wires to stop the program from execution so that you can actually debug the program. Talking about the debugger, let's look at what is the debugging experience like. Let's say we have a traditional to-do app, and as we type some input, let's say let's write some, let's fill in and value, and as you see here, there is like a problem, and now we have to debug it. To all the people who raised their hands for my first question of using console.log, including me, what is easy to most of us is going to the source code and start typing console.log. It's easy, it gets the job done. And literally go and type console.log only to have one of your coworkers during the pull request saying, please disable this, or your lint telling or complaining saying, oh, there is a console.log, please disable it. We all go through this. But let's see how this experience can get better by using a debugger. So using a debugger, the first point, as I told you, the common term, what is attributed to debugger are breakpoints. And the same example, you write something, you have some unknown output there. So you open the debugger panel, you locate the source code, and instead of opening in your editor, you open on the browser, and on line number 10, let's say we set a breakpoint. And then now when you go back and enter a value, the program pauses because there is a breakpoint on line number 10. And then there is, if you hover on the things like, let's say, title, there is a bunch of information that is being shown. And if you step over to see what exactly value is logged at that particular time, there is like a lot of information that is being seen. So title, as you expect, is not a value, but it's like there is something more to this. And that is why you see in the output on the browser a typical object and not the value that you would expect. So it looks like things are not right. Also, along with the breakpoint, you can also console.log value here, something like this. So at that particular time, title is an object, but what we are looking for in this particular use case has to be a title.value. And going back to the source code, correcting it without having to add manual console.log statements in the code editor, it's easy to do things on the browser so that you don't have to erase them or don't have to go through this lint complaining or one of your coworkers having to constantly remind you not to do this. It comes quite handy. Talking about the debugging experience, the debugger also needs to understand common tools like Webpack, Babel, TypeScript. As you see in this example, it knows Webpack if the code is bundled using Webpack or if the source code is written using React. As we saw in the previous example, the debugger shows the logos, which for us developers, it becomes quite handy. Source map support. As modern the development tools like Webpack or Babel, they are good, they generate a minified version, but if you were to debug this minified version, it would be a nightmare. And the debugger, a good debugging experience should be like, when you look into the debugger, you should be able to look at all the files and give you an example that you're actually debugging a source code. So as in this example, the debugger is able to map the source to its original source, and it feels like you're not debugging on a browser, but actually on an editor. So you have all the files, and you can add breakpoints, you can add additional statements without changing a single line in your source code. Worker threads are what powers the modern web. It takes off the load from the main UI thread, and there needs to be a good debugging support for worker threads too. And the debugger also has a thread panel where you can given that one particular project uses multiple threads, you can actually get into each thread and pause independent execution so that you know which thread is working at given one particular point of time. There is also another feature called log points, and this is one of my favorite features, or at least it's easier to convince people to not having to write console.log statements in the source code or in the editor, but you can add console.log statements on the browser. And this one is called log points. So now in this example, let's say on line number 23, click on add log, and instead of, it's like just adding a console.log statement in the browser. And what it does is, it gives you the same experience of how one would manually enter console.log statement in the editor, but you don't have to erase them. So as you see here, because there is a log point written there, and you just get a log of all the values, and this becomes quite handy when you have to debug. Or at least this is a very nice feature to give debugger a try. There is also something called condition breakpoints. So let's say on this particular line, instead of breakpoints or instead of log, you can choose an option of adding condition log points. So this gives you a better experience of logging values only at certain conditions and not populating your the log output. In short, the debugger tries to provide a first-class debugging experience, and as I mentioned already, once we start learning the basics, it gets quite handy, and it's very easy to realize that it can literally save you from hours of frustration, maybe that one small typo error that we all forgot, or that one semicolon missing. The debugger philosophy. I mentioned in the beginning, the debugger's tech stack is rewritten from scratch after Firebug was unified into the modern DevTools. It was rewritten using Scratch, using React and Redux. So in short, the debugger that we are talking about becomes a web application. And when you inspect the running debugger app, you are debugging a web app. So let's say this is the debugger in dev mode that you're debugging. And as I mentioned, this particular debugger that you see is a web application written using React and Redux, which means as a web application, the way you debug applications, you should also be able to debug this debugger. So Firefox, when you debug in developer mode, it comes with an additional option called Web Developer and Browser Toolbox. And if you open this, you see a debugger to actually debug your debugger. This is what I was trying to tell all the time, debugging the debugger. And the debugger that I was talking until now is actually a web application. So in short, this is a web application that is a debugger whose source code is written using React and Redux. And on opening the browser toolbox, you get this debugger. Still with me? OK. In short, this becomes the debuggy, the web application, and this is now the debugger, which helps you debug the debugger. So in short, as the saying goes, eating your own dog shit. This might start feeling like Inception, the debugger, and the debugging. So more to come on this. The debugger philosophy, to summarize in one line, is if you can build a web application, then you should be able to hack the debugger. Now, the next question. If the debugger is a web application, yes, it's written using React and Redux, then how does this app know to debug another app, that too on the browser? Say, for example, you're writing a React application, and then now you use another application to debug your React application, which is also written using React and Redux. In short, how will this debugger, which is a web application, know to talk to the browser or connect to the browser, get certain information, and know to debug this particular thing? So Firefox has a server which provides an API for this web application or the debugger to talk to the browser via an API called Remote Debugging Protocol. The debugging protocol allows the debugger to connect to a browser, and the protocol operates at the JavaScript level. So as I told you, what you see is the debugger, which is the client, and this is the application that we are talking about, which is built using React and Redux. And this, on the other side, is the server or the browser, and the two of these talk to each other via remote debugging protocol using JSON objects. And this remote debugging protocol itself is on the JavaScript level and not in C or C++ level, so which is like a good thing for the two of them to talk to each other using JSON objects. If you're convinced by now that debugger is worth a try, or because it's still an open source project and it's a web application, we are familiar with the stack, React and Redux, then you can head on to this docs.firefox dev.tools to give it a try. And once you get the source code, after, if you're lucky, the first try, but most of us are not so lucky because you have to literally build debugging version of Firefox. It takes a while, but it's worth it. And finally, when things are up, you will have your own Firefox browser, your version of Firefox browser, which will have a debugger. And now let's only focus on the debugger. The others are all the part of the DevTools, the inspector, the network, the performance monitor, etc. But let's say the debugger, we want to change the, let's say the color of this particular panel. That's the source panel. Now, once you have the source code, you can go into the DevTools category. And as I mentioned, the DevTools has two things, client and the server, and the debugger falls on the client side. And as you can see, it's like the source code is all pretty much React and Redux. And to change the source code of the source pane, let's try to change some CSS CSS lines. Let's change the color from the boring gray to let's put it like some nice fancy blue, and let's make all the necessary changes. And then you just have to restart the developer version of Firefox, and then you can either go that way, or the current repository is based on Mercurial. You can run the command, and you get this. So because it's a debugger, you should be literally able to do all the things that we are used to do for a web application. As mentioned already, this is like a web application. So now our other debugger, which comes with part of the DevTools, you should be able to track down what color is this, or literally play around, or apply any new CSS properties, etc., etc. It's that easy. Yeah, so the first one is a web application, and the other one is a debugger. And all the things that I mentioned, which are part of the debugging experience, so you can see on the right side, there are like the worker threads. There is like the source code, which is like the source mapping is pretty great. There is like support for worker threads, and it knows if the source code is written in React, Angular, Vue, etc., etc. So again, time to sink in and get back to the concept of inception. It's like a web app, and if you're able to write a web app, then it's pretty much easy to debug this web application or the debugger. What is more exciting, or what is something coming up further, is something called time travel debugging. As Albert Einstein once said, the only reason for time is so that everything does not happen at once. So there is this experimental technology, and disclaimer, for now it works only on Mac OS Firefox nightly builds. Firefox comes with technology called Web Replay, which lets you record executions and play them exactly how they happened at certain point of time. It could be JavaScript, it could be CSS, any part of the DOM. All of this, anything related to the web, can be replayed. So to go to this on Firefox nightly, only on Mac OS, one has to enable the DevTools record replay MVP.enable flag set to true. And once it's there, you see a special button there, which is the web replay button. And once recording, you see the special toolbar, which is like play record, or a record player. So in short, what it does, you have a to-do application, try to add something, and now it is replaying everything. So notice the additional dots which get added here as you add more times. In short, these are only building to the time. And when you pause it, you can actually stop this and get back to the exact context that you once were. Or at least history would be kind to you, for anyone can debug. As already mentioned, the circles there, they represent certain times, and you see the output in the console.log. And the interesting thing is, one will actually get what that title.value was at certain given point of time. And there are also special buttons like the rewind button, or the reverse step over button, which are like very handy. And as for developers, who better can relate to statements like "it works on my machine"? So once this is actually live, or it comes to many people, a lot of the frustration of "works on my machine" can be solved, because Web Replay has this option of record. You can record something and share with your coworkers, and when you replay, you will exactly get back to that particular point of time. So in short, things are quite exciting, and I'm here representing the debugger community, which is like almost 462 members, and we take in new contributors. So if at all, any point you're looking for that one particular open source project to look at, do give Debugger a try. After all, it's just a web application written using React and Redux. So credits to the slide, and thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. Have a nice day. Thank you.